Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Curut Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1995 movie titled Murder in the First. Now, Murder in the First runs for 2 hours and 2 minutes long. It is directed by the late great Marc Rocco. It is produced by Mark Friedman and Mark Walper, so I guess you could say this movie made it. Mark. It is distributed by Warner Brothers, and the cinematography was done by Fred Murphy. The script was by Dan Gordon. The editing was by Russ Livingstone. The score was done by Christopher Young, and the stars of the movie are Kevin Bacon, Christian Slater, Gary Oldman, William H. Macy, Beth Davis, a cameo from Kyra Sedgewick, Stephen Tobolosky, and R. Lee Ermey. Now, what did I think about this movie? Let's just say that if you could avoid the fact that this movie was not based on historical accuracy, I think you will enjoy it much better as a courtroom drama, a prison drama, much very similar to such movies like Midnight Express, The Shawshank Redemption, and one of my personal favorites, Return to Paradise. Now, Murder in the First commences to the year 1935 as a down-on-his-luck young man named Henry Young, played by Kevin Bacon, desperately steals $5 from a post office. His criminal act leads harshly to be sentenced to 5 years in prison. The worst part is Mr. Young is only 17 years old. So this opening scene begins this superficial story of Henry Young in his time in Alcatraz. Now, there really was Henry Young, but his prison sentence was more harsh than just stealing $5. I know this was set in the Great Depression, and $5 actually meant a lot compared to today's standards. $5 back in the 1930s was the equivalent to $20 by today's standards. But his criminal act actually is far worse than that. He was actually convicted of murder and bank robbery, the real Henry Young. But in this case, he kind of almost plays off a Jean Valjean type character in Les Miserables. He served time for stealing money to feed himself and his sister, who I believe was pregnant. So in a way, this movie almost has a bit of Les Miserables flowing through it as well. Prison life has not been the life for Young, as he and other inmates try to make a great effort to escape, only to be caught red-handed, thanks to some snitching from a fellow inmate. Young gets sent to a dungeon where he remains in solitary confinement for the next 3 years. During that time, he was under supervision by the guards and one very mean warden named Milton Glenn, played by Gary Oldman, who hated Young for the first time he ever laid eyes on him, and he was physically tortured and incapacitated while remaining in the hole. And during his time in the hole, he was like in real complete isolation, complete alienation from seeing people. He didn't even really have any place to release himself whenever he needed to either urinate or defecate. I mean, in complete isolation from any kind of life. 3 years later, Henry is released from solitary confinement, but has become a complete shell of his former self. So much so that as an act of revenge, Young unintentionally kills the brown-nosed inmate who tattled on him when he was making his escape. Now Young finds himself in much deeper offense, as he is now convicted of first-degree murder and maybe potentially sentenced to death by gas chamber. His appointed attorney is James Stamphill, played by Christian Slater, who pays Young a visit to Alcatraz. At first glance, he appears to look like a malnourished, decrepit, elderly individual, when in reality he was only just a couple years older than Stamphill. The harsh and physical punishment he's endured during his incarceration has him now unable to walk upright. His legs and his back are crippled, and his speech is very slurred, and his mind is almost lost. It's like as if the guy has dementia. He eventually now has just the mental capacity of a child. And the only thing he can remember were happy times involving baseball and Babe Ruth. Stamphill, who's a rookie lawyer, finds himself in a precarious situation and finds it very difficult to communicate with someone in the state that Ermey is in. Stamphill, finding the only way to open up to Ermey is by talking to him about baseball. Although through many visits, Ermey progressively opens up to Stamphill, which leads to Stamphill going over his head. Leaving him with no real hope, Stamphill tries to persuade Ermey to plead innocent and to overrule the trial, and instead blame the penal system, the state of California, and Alcatraz for the reason behind his murder. Stamphill blames Alcatraz for turning Ermey into the insane person that he has become. In one of the more humorous scenes, Stamphill brings in a hooker posed as one of his assistants. It's a cameo appearance from Kyra, Sedgewick. This was a ploy to offer something to Ermey to do because he was never able to enjoy the moment because of his long prison sentence and because he was very young when he was first incarcerated. But this effort and the baseball discussions between Ermey and Stamphill, the bonding between both men continued until Ermey's death. The reality is that, Ermey did not just go to Alcatraz right away. He was, sent to other prison systems in Montana and Washington before making his home in Alcatraz. And the reality also was that there was no James Stamphill, there was no Milton Glenn. They were just composite characters. Most of the other characters in there, including Judge Clausen and a hooker named Blanche, they're all fictional characters. Let's face it, this is a work of fiction. It's not a true story. It's not based on actual events. The only real character, I think, in this movie of them all is just Ermey Young. Everybody else is fiction. The story, too, is fictional and historically inaccurate, but it's still the making of a good storytelling of a true character in an untrue piece of American history. In an excellent trial scene, Stamphill successfully proves to the judicial system that Ermey was left in the unmerciful hands of Milton Green, and completely lays the blame to the penal system, which eventually leads to the potential closing of Alcatraz, another misnomer. Alcatraz only shut down because it was under a financial situation and the finances were just too expensive to keep it in operation. The Ermey Young trial did not end Alcatraz. Alcatraz still kept on running, and it only shut down by around maybe the 60s or 70s. And Ermey Young did not die in Alcatraz. In reality, he was eventually released and he was sent to another penitentiary system. He made an escape, he disappeared, he never came back, and it's unknown what has become of him. We're not even sure if he went off to some deserted island where he remained there for the remainder of his life. We don't know if he just escaped in 1972 at the age of 61 and went off to commit suicide. he just practically disappeared without a trace, never to be heard from again. That's the real Henry Young's story. So continuing on with the story in this movie, Henry must return to Alcatraz until the paperwork leading to his release has been done. In a memorable scene, we see Henry getting on a boat, begging Stamphill not to send him back. He is now officially emancipated, but can't understand why he must wait for this paperwork to be completed in order to get out of Alcatraz. Henry was never discharged from Alcatraz and remained there until his death. Remember, this is only a work of fiction. It's not real, folks. So don't be gullible into thinking that this movie is based on historical facts, because it simply is not. Does that mean that this movie is complete bullshit? No. I actually thought that even though it was loosely based on real characters, and I do mean loosely, like in very loose, the performances were absolutely phenomenal, especially from the three principals, being Christian Slater, Kevin Bacon, and Gary Oldman. For the past 3 decades, the ladies have had their hearts melting for the very attractive Kevin Bacon. So much so that he was looked upon as just bona fide eye candy. But in reality, Kevin Bacon is much more than just eye candy. He is quite a very versatile actor, capable of playing a lot of great phenomenal characters throughout the past. And he never ceases to amaze you just how talented he is. It's just too bad he has never really emerged above, star status. But here, I think he really one-upped himself, and it was a shame that the Academy Awards deprived him of getting an Oscar win, let alone a nomination, because he was just so freaking phenomenal here. The sacrifices he did to himself physically by losing 25 pounds and making himself as unattractive as possible was absolutely great. How he sacrificed his good looks to play a malnourished, mistreated miscreant. I'm not finished yet. But this movie, they could see just how riveting he is in a highly respected performance he delivers here. His manners and his characteristics were truly realistic. Christian Slater, he was the perfect casting choice for the part of the green, inexperienced lawyer thrown into a case that he has never thought possible. His fight against the penal system in Alcatraz, even though fictitious, it still was handled with care, and it never once felt forced or rushed. Gary Oldman, well, he's been quite versatile with his roles over the years, playing good guy characters and bad guy characters, and here he is fucking mean to the core. Even his character role of Dracula looks like a saint compared to this hardened warden that he plays here in this movie. I mean, he was like evil to the bone, and I'm glad that he got his comeuppance in the end. So maybe there was a weakness there, it was a little predictable that once again the guards in the prison system was treated like they were bad guys and the prisoners were the poor misfortunate souls. No. Prisoners, when they're thrown in jail, there's a reason why. And like I say, if you do the time, if you commit the crime, you do the time. Easy as that. These guys are just doing it for the money. They're trying to put food on their table. And in real life, prison guards and wardens, the only time they discipline prisoners is when things do get out of hand, and they do, and sometimes they do have to use force. But that's the only thing that really went wrong in this movie. Even though the story is inspired by real events and characters, it is still a work of fiction. However, the situations do look and feel real. The execution of the story and the characters really draw you, and we really root the whole time for Henry in hopes that he is able to be released before it's too late. So I think this ends our review. Take care of yourselves. Please write back to me as soon as possible. Goodbye.